Um, Luke Mehl is joining us. He's the owner of Triple Point Training for the recording. He's going to help us with a workshop today that explores what mountain recreation teaches us about understanding and managing risk in any environment. Drawing from experience in outdoor settings, we're going to explore personal and operational risk tolerance, as well as common habits that lead to incidents, and then connect these lessons to practical tools for decision-making, situational awareness, and improved communication. Hopefully, we all leave with transferable insights to reduce consequences and improve performance. I think anyone who's been working in like the outdoor rec world up here for more than a decade has like seen the evolution towards professionalism. Like my first guide training 17 years ago in Alaska was like a tutorial on how to drink IPA in campgrounds. That was like what we learned for a week. And I didn't learn any like risk management skills or anything like that. I once took a whitewater training in which the instructor, I think, took a hit of acid before we started. So it's like what happened back then and what is happening now feels like a really cool progression. And I think if you were around like 30 years ago, it might feel like we've gotten really institutionalized, but hopefully we've just gotten smarter. And I think knowing how we manage our risk helps us have more fun. And if you're a decision maker in an organization, I think having like an operational risk mindset and a good risk management plan can help you sleep. Like you wake up less at 2 in the morning, like with your jaw clenched and hyperventilating because you know you have a good plan for your young people in the field who are holding chainsaws. So yeah, I'm excited for Luke to present to us, and I'm gonna let you take it away, Luke. Biggify your screen real quick.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
That was a really fitting introduction because this very much is like my learning progression in this space. And I have always enjoyed research. I like the academic part of this. And when I started applying my research skills to outdoor recreation and risk, the most rewarding part was when I saw that somebody, like a professor, some hotshot somewhere, had a model for something that I'd kind of already figured out on my own, or had like an intuition that like, this is the right way, this is something we do to manage crevasse hazard or something else. So it was really empowering to see like smarter people that already figured this out, had a clever acronym for it and everything. And so what I've prepared here is kind of an art through this space of combining things that I sort of figured out or had hints of in the field, and then finding that in the more academic research, and then using those to sort of plot a path forward, like how can we be the best at making decisions. I'm totally okay with this being pretty casual, you getting up, moving around. I'm also interrupting and taking tangents. I think we have plenty of time to cover all this. The tricky part with the time management is that the more interactive it is, the less time I have available to go through like the main talking points that I want to get to you. And I just don't know how that's going to work. So let's be a little bit organic with that. One thing that might work is I could sort of pre-assign some roles to different organizations. So I kind of want to do that if you're game for it. It'll be a little bit experiment, and if it doesn't work, we can bail on it. But folks I already know, Will, Interior Trails. Are there 6 or 7 other sort of organizations represented here? Joey, who are you with?
AK Trails.
Dang it. Well, let's do AK Trails. Yeah.
National Forest Foundation.
Say again?
National Forest Foundation.
National Forest Foundation. It is Joey, right? What's your name?
Annie.
Annie with National. Oh, Annie. Hi.
Hey.
Annie, Joey. Yeah. Larry with Mountain Valley Bikers Hikers. Close enough. Okay, I need 2 more.
Mason, the VLR.
Thanks, Mason. Again, this is an experiment. We can bail on it. I love running experiments. That'll be part of talking points. Janice? Single Trail Advocates. Okay, thanks for humoring with me with this. Let's see how it goes. Did you have questions for me? The closer is better, okay, perfect. Any other feedback? It's all about feedback. Okay, so personally, the problem that I'm trying to solve in this space is why do smart, experienced people still make mistakes? And the mistakes that I'm feeling most personally are guides and instructors and experts that are dying in the mountains. Coming at this from a recreational background. The problem that you might be trying to solve, the mistakes that you might be trying to solve might be, why do we keep having trouble maintaining personnel? Why is our equipment always out of order? I worked a little bit with interior trails, so it's like I can only, not that those things have happened with interior trails. So you might have different problems that you're trying to solve, but I think ultimately it's like, why aren't we perfect? And so we're going to spend a couple. Is this cutting in and out for you?
Yeah, the little toggle, you just want it to be up, yeah, there you go.
So you might have other problems you're trying to solve. I think it's actually in the mic.
Not tech people, try to do them. Test, test.
Try to hold it differently. Okay, so even if you have different problems you're trying to solve, I think this arc is going to be helpful. These are all examples. It took about 14 seconds in Google to come up with all these matches. I just typed in like instructor that died in the field, professional that died in the field. And it's like, and for those of you that knew Dylan, worked with Avalanche School, a coworker of mine died last week, and an avalanche. It's like, this is very personal to me. Super experienced guy and smart. So the pitch I'm going to make, and it's helpful for you all, because I think we all have the same interest in outdoor recreation and time spent in the mountains, is that the similarities and differences between what we can learn in the mountains and what we might learn professionally. They're both really complex environments. There's a lot of factors that go into them. But in the mountains, I think it's really easy to run experiments. Like, I'm going to lean harder to my right. I'm going to try to get air on this little lip. I'm going to paddle a class 2 rapid. And it's pretty easy to get feedback from those experiments. Like, whoops, that was too much of a rapid. Whoops, I leaned too far. And those consequences are pretty easy to anticipate as well. One of my mentors in this space is Will Gadd. He's a professional ice climber. And he has a great sort of hierarchy of consequence that he used when his kids were young. And that hierarchy was bumps and bruises, hospital, and death. But it's kind of that simple when we're out in the mountains. It's like, what could go wrong here? Bumps and bruises, hospital, death. And I don't run a big organization like many of you, but when you have a bunch of employees and you're working in multiple sites, like things are so much more complex. Running experiments is harder. Getting the feedback of what works is harder, whether that's profitability or completing trails. And I think it's a lot harder to guess at the consequences of your decisions. Does that feel relatively true for where you're at? I'm making a lot of assumptions because I don't do your work. You on board? More or less. So the way that I'm going to end this arc is with these 3 points. So we'll come back to them. Expecting mistakes is key. If it is cutting out, right?
It's just the wobbliness.
I can try to go without it, but is it?
It's better with, but I think it's just if it wobbles too much.
I'll try 16.
Yeah. Keep going.
So this is where we're going to end, but I just wanted to give you a tease where we're going to end. Expecting mistakes and planning for the consequences. So as opposed to expecting perfection and thinking we're so good at planning that we're not going to have any of these things happen. Recognizing the space of nearly normal. This is a fuzzy zone between normal and not normal. We'll go into all these in more detail. And then concluding that communication is what drives all risk management. Communication is risk management. Okay, now I'm having trouble with the computer progressing. We're stuck. So here's the arc. I introduced the problem from my perspective. We're going to talk about incidents, risk tolerance, experience, learning from experience, mistakes, making decisions, and communication. And I'm gonna, the names that I got from people, I'm gonna solicit from you some examples for each of these fields. So this first one, I'm just gonna prepare you interior trails since I know you the best. I'm gonna end this section and ask you to provide an example of an incident or a potential incident that fits into these models, the models you'll see in a second. And then we'll play this game with the other folks in the room. So I'll start this one with a story. And all the way up to the silver glass. Great.
That's just fine.
Okay, so I'm gonna introduce this one with a story. The worst thing that happened to me in the mountains was getting buried in an avalanche. And this was the trip. We were starting in Yakutat to go climb Mount Logan. So it was a 1 month trip, 370 miles, monster trip. It was like peak athletic fitness, great group dynamic. And after a week of slogging to get to the base of the mountain, we start climbing. And it's our first opportunity to get up high. Like finally, everything's been an approach so far. And we started later in the day than we would have otherwise, but we just been slogging for so long. It's just like that motivation to do something, to start the actual climb. So we're going up a 200-meter face, not a huge face, but at the top of that, we caused an avalanche, and I was caught in that debris, and the guy above me was caught just above the debris, so he ragdolled, he just tumbled. But I was fully in the snow. I had to keep coughing to clear snow from my throat. And there was a bergschrund halfway down the slope. Folks that aren't familiar with that, like a crevasse where the snow slope is creeping away from the mountainside. And I knew that thing was coming because we'd walked around it. And I was just waiting because if I went into the bergschrund, there would have been no recovery for sure. And I'm waiting and I'm waiting and I feel myself airborne over that bergschrund. And then I feel myself land on the other side. And it was so this moment of glory. It was just like, I'm not in the bergschrund. But this is terrifying, right? When we get to the bottom, I'm buried. I was able at the last minute to punch my arm through and get an airway along my arm. And breathe. And again, this like joy, pure joy to have that airway. Like, I am just fine. This is going to be just fine. I'm just waiting for the rest of my team to come get me. It's probably hard to see in the light here. There's two people at the very top, little white dots, and then there's that big bergschrund in the middle. So I stood that whole path. And so viewing this as an incident, there are a couple of different ways to approach it. And earlier in this century, the 20th century, there was a simple domino model for accidents. And it's linear, it's simple, it makes sense where I'll go and read this out in case you're having trouble seeing them. The social environment is a domino, is a factor that tips another domino. The fault of the person tips another domino. Unsafe act tips another one, the accident tips another one, the injury. So in a model like this, we could say, so of the group of 5 of us, 2 of them were named Josh. So we can just say that Josh caused this avalanche, just statistically, right? It's most likely that it was somebody named Josh. So let's say Josh caused this avalanche. And we could come up with a whole backstory about why they messed up. And to prevent this from happening again, we could just remove that domino that is Josh, or why Josh messed up, because it was a bad training, bad equipment, whatever it was. It's like, let's just pull that domino out and then the rest can't talk. Does that make sense? But I think you probably know enough about, at least from what I conveyed so far, like it's pretty unlikely that one person messed up and caused this thing to happen. So this is an outdated model. But a lot of organizations are still doing something similar. It's like, that's the problem, we just pluck it out and isolate it. More recently, this is a model from James Reason, Swiss cheese model. And when I first saw this, it was also new to a lot of other people, but now it seems like everybody's seen it, I think, since COVID. Is this new to anyone? It's okay if it is. Yeah, good, great. Okay, so we'll just take a couple minutes. The Swiss cheese model, the idea here is that you have a whole stack of barriers, protective barriers. Those are the slices of cheese. And within each barrier, there can be gaps or holes. And so things go wrong when those gaps of different slices just happen to align wrong. I love this model, and it's great for teaching, if any of you are doing teaching, because it makes sense. It's pretty intuitive. When it gained popularity with COVID, the barriers were like 6-foot spacing, face masks, vaccinations, right? So those could all be there, but you still could get exposed and get COVID. If I apply this to the avalanche world, I could say that one of those barriers of protection is terrain, is choosing good terrain. And that barrier is basically complete if you're in green terrain that can't slide. But there might be a little gap of yellow, there might be a big gap of red, there might be holes where you have cliff bands or rocks or trees or other hazards. So that's why it's not a perfect barrier. And you can stack that barrier up with the snowpack and the weather and the terrain, and ideally protect yourself from an incident. Or if all of those things happen, your final barrier would be your rescue skills, your beacon, shovel, rope, your ability to take somebody out. Make sense? You guys are quieter than I want. So it'll help with grow tomatoes or something. Any questions on Swiss cheese? That help, Will?
Going great. I love it.
Thank Will.
Keep going.
Okay, here's another part of this space, safety drift. Other people call this normalization of deviance. That's a lot of bigger words. So safety drift sticks in my brain better. And the idea here is you have a space of baseline performance. That's where everything is going as it's designed and planned. And then you have a space of accident. But realistically, we are often in this space and moving back and forth. This was it 2 years ago that there were a bunch of Boeing jet crashes, like kind of one after another. And I could kind of watch the industry from afar there and see that, you know, the crash was hitting that accident, and then the response was boom, slam back to baseline performance. And then maybe some creeping, some cutting corners until there's another incident, bam, slam back. And the things that might cause shifting within this space would be new management, complacency, changing climate. I think a lot of things that I see this in the villages with snow machines breaking through the ice, zones that used to be reliable at a certain time of year are less reliable now. So that could be a shift within this space. Questions on this space?
Just with the snow machines crashing through, we actually had an incident this winter where we had a backpacker go through the river on additional crossings because we had some need help. Incidents. They were fine, but they were fully submerged.
I'll just repeat it in case the mic doesn't catch that, the recording. Will just gave an example of a fat biker breaking through Eagle River ice in an area that had been traditionally been a safe crossing. So great example. Other questions on safety drift? So interior trails, what I'm going to end this with, I'm going to ask you to come up with an example of either domino or Swiss cheese or safety drift, or some sort of example from your work, if that's possible. You could make it up too, it's okay. I'm not ready though. Okay, so with all of these, what I'm trying to do is convey there are commonalities between incidents. And if we can recognize those ahead of time, it's going to help us. It's going to like trigger that switch that says, hey, heads up. We're in this space where incidents sometimes happen. or that's the domino thinking or the Swiss cheese model, safety drift. Here's another one. There's a space of normal and there's a space of not normal. And it's pretty easy to make decisions in both of those. If conditions are normal, you're like, great, let's do this. If conditions are not normal, it's pretty easy to say like, no, this isn't normal for us. We don't work in these conditions. And then the problem is that there's can be a pretty wide zone in between those of nearly normal, like this fuzzy zone. And I bet, and we'll revisit it, that a lot of you can relate to this. You can often feel it. It's a little maybe intuitive or subconscious, where it's like, man, things are just a little bit outside of what we normally do. Sometimes it's explicit. You're like, I am cheating because, and sometimes it's more like things don't feel quite right. And we're often in that space, and that's often where the incidents happen, because it's so easy to make decisions in the normal and in the not normal. And the point is not that we need to bail out anytime you get that feeling of like things aren't quite right. The point is that we need to revise the plan. Like, we are smart enough to accommodate these changes, to accommodate the crossing that's no longer reliable. So it doesn't mean like, do not fat bike in Eagle River, period. It's like, well, we need to make a new plan, whether that's testing the ice or putting up signage, and we can do that. So the takeaway of this section, we're getting close to your part, interior trails. Most incidents happen by a series of small, reasonable decisions, like little things that make sense at the time that just happen to align wrong. And often we can identify that space, we can feel that space with this feeling of things are just not quite normal. Things are nearly normal. So if you're up for it, and you share, and I think you should probably take the mic for the microphone up here. Can you share an example of either domino or Swiss cheese or safety drift within your profession?
Hey, Luke, while she's coming up, I'd like to say one thing that I heard we have to talk about that is that the nearly normal space is, like all of us, whether it's an expedition like you're referring to, or a lot of us in work environment, it's such a dynamic environment. And the changes are so incremental. Weather changes, slope angle changes, all the things that are, you're in the normal space, it's totally fine, and it's changed just a little bit. And another hour, it's changed just a little bit. And in another hour, it's changed just a little bit, but it's changed a lot from the normal line. So that's part of why it's sneaks up on people.
It is a great, great example. Let me just repeat it for the mic up here. Gabe's saying part of the challenge in the nearly normal is that when we make incremental steps, it's hard to actually monitor how much is changing. If we could see the start and the finish, we're like, oh wow, things have actually changed a lot, which is great insight. So part of what we want to do is both get better at monitoring those changes and ideally like shrinking nearly normal. And we'll come back to that.
This is the true confessions thing. And immediately leapt into my mind, we had a really perfect example of, I think all three of the components are relevant here. We had a last year on our crew, we had a minor chainsaw. I guess it was a close call more than a real injury, although there was stress injury, I think. So that in light of yesterday's conversation is probably still relevant. So just as the background, our crew had a lot of returning people. Everybody had had our baseline chainsaw training, including the crew member for whom this incident happened, but the crew member had not had a lot of field monitoring yet. And we were clear at the beginning, I want more time one-on-one with crew, this person. Then the season started and I was the one who was like, I want the one-on-one. A couple of different reasons where I wasn't in on a hitch for 2 in a row. The progression of production was slow, so all of us were feeling a little urgency. And the person who needed the supervision was really motivated and talented and wanted to learn how to run a stop. So those were the layers. And so we were gone, I was gone. The feeling of urgency was building. We were down 2 sawyers and the person wanted to go. So they did. And that could have been fine, but it ended in a kickback incident that could have been really bad and wasn't, thankfully. So there was a big debrief about that where we talked about the I don't want to call it failure, but the lapse in each level, the structural organizational layer where we should have been clearer. No one is running a saw until this happens with me one-on-one and we sign off. There was too much drift around, like, we're all friends, she's really good, I'm sure she'll pick it up, I don't want to be, whatever. Then there was the true layer of like, oh man, we're really behind. I mean, do you think, do you want to? And then there's the personal layer, like, yeah, I think I could do that. Like, I'm ready. Let me at it. And so they all lined up, and the whole was just the incident that I think maybe could have been prevented from a slower buildup, a more kind of analyzed sense of what to expect when, and a more like, this is on me to be supervising you, as opposed to like, hey, can you do this? Oh yeah, why don't you take over? There was a lot of that. So yeah, it was a big deal, and I'm really glad it went as well as it did.
I was just gonna say that one of the pieces of strategy is that although it didn't, or there wasn't a line was the PE. So the reason that there wasn't an increase, besides the stress increase, not insignificant, but there were a number of pieces of cheese, and there were a lot of them with line, but there was still a protective barrier that kept from being, hospitalization or death for that in the gap. So it's, that's the advantage of multiple layers.
I'm just gonna repeat it here for the recording. Gabe's addition is that this would have been a much worse incident, except for the final barrier worked, which is personal protective equipment. Yeah. Thanks, Christine. Thanks, Gabe. Questions for them, for me, through them, through me, for them?
Through the speaker to the house.
Yeah. Okay, perfect example, and maybe 80 years ago, your employee, we'll call her Josh. Maybe you're just like, man, Josh was the problem, right? And you obviously don't have that standpoint. We evolve, we're all evolving. But that, especially, these models are really mostly coming from the manufacturing sector. It's like the problem happens in the manufacturing process, and it's like, pluck Josh out. So we're going to transition to the next block, which is that a shared vocabulary will help us catch these nearly normal conditions. Like, how are we good at communicating about it? Any questions before we move on? So the shared vocabulary is going to be about risk. These are terms that have been helpful for me. My background with this is that when I wrote the Packraft handbook, I had a friend read it, and he was like, oh, you use hazard and danger here and there. And it's like, what do you mean by that? And I was like, oh, I mean, and I sat down to write it down. I was like, man, I have no idea what these words mean. Like, just kind of like using them interchangeably. And so since then, I've been on an effort to get better with the terminology and see what people are using. We're going to talk about two different models here, one in terms of hazard, exposure, and vulnerability, and another in terms of probability and consequence. Will, at the end of this is where you're going to put you on the spot to come up with an example. It's okay. I'll give you an example right now, and you can just do it, but with different words. So this is a picture of my wife in the Alaska range, and she has had a few anaphylactic reactions to stings. You're okay. The first one was the day after we got married, like the morning after we got married, we go to a lake, we're eating leftover pizza, and she got sting, and she just turned into this, who's the friendly monster guy in Goonies? Chunk. Thanks, Jody. So she's like morphed into Chunk. And we were both just like, what do we do? And it was a big deal. But we were like on the road system, we go home, she's in the bathtub, I got a doctor friend on the phone that's in the neighborhood. It's like, when do we need to go to the hospital if we need to? And then a few years later, she was doing a trip in the Alaska range and got stung out there. And then she was so much more vulnerable out there. And it was stormy, and they would have flown a helicopter in to get her, but the helicopter couldn't go. And so it would have been it was almost a really big deal. And 80 years ago, it would have been a death. It's like, we've built all these tools to make us less vulnerable. So in this example, if I use our terms hazard and exposure and vulnerability, take a note, Will. The hazard was the insect, the stinging insect, the bee, or bees in general. Exposure was Sarah. She was exposed to this hazard. And we could even get into more detail with exposure about like, was she wearing long sleeves or short? And what kind of terrain was she in? Was it summer or winter? Those things would all affect her exposure to this hazard. She has no control over the hazard, and that's typically true. I'll give you more examples in a second, but I'll flesh this out. And then vulnerability, there are quite a few things Sarah could do to influence her vulnerability. One was carry an EpiPen, which she had. She had it right in the hip pack. She's been doing this for 4 years since our marriage. She's got a little fanny pack, and it's got 2 EpiPens. It's got Benadryl. It's like she's so well prepared for this. She's just done the woofer. And so having an EpiPen really reduced her vulnerability. She also happened to be with 2 EMTs. Both of her partners on the trip were EMTs. It's like, wow, that's a lucky draw. But that partnership really reduced her vulnerability. Okay, so we have things that we can influence and things we can't. She can't really influence the existence of stinging insects, but she can influence her exposure and she can influence her vulnerability. You're gonna be able to do something like that in 5 minutes? Okay, so let me zoom out for a second. I gave you this example. The risk part of this is the overlap, the intersection of hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. And I don't want to miss the point of taking a risk is because we get a reward, and that reward might be learning, it might be income, it might be love. It's like any decision that we're making, there's a positive on the backside of that. I focus so much on the risk, so much on the negatives that I just need to like, even for myself, to be like, hold on. We do these things because there are rewards. Hazards, the things we can't control that do harm. Exposure, the stuff, whether it's people or property exposed to the hazard. Vulnerability, how bad, how likely. And that's kind of a nebulous container, and a lot of people don't use it at all. It's kind of drop vulnerability from the equation, and that's fine. But I like it. Examples of environmental hazards, things I have no control over: avalanches, high water, wood in the river, wildlife, air speed, air temperature, blowing snow. Subjective or more human hazards: communication, group dynamic, maybe our maintenance of our equipment choices, the decisions we make. Big group versus small group. There's a pretty cool study about groups in avalanche terrain, size 1, 2, 4, and 8, as far as how well they did at picking up information about an unstable snowpack. Within that space, 1, 2, 4, and 8, which group size do you think did best at getting those clues? Group of 4? Yeah, the 2 and 4 were pretty darn close. The surprise for me is that 1 and 8 were also pretty much the same. So being in a group of 8 in this study, and it's just one study and not many data points, but that group of 8 was about as good as making decisions as one person, or about as good as receiving data observations during their tour. So I take that with me now when I'm in a big group. It's like, hold on, this is basically like you're by yourself. And I think you can all relate to this, right? You assume somebody else is probably, oh, they probably thought about that. They probably know what's around the corner. Questions on these? Terminology. The point for me, it's invaluable to be able to say, hey, this is a human hazard. This is an environmental hazard. We have no control over this. Just using that language when I'm on a summit, on a river. When we talk about exposure, you might think in terms of degree of exposure or exposure time. So my example of degree of exposure, these are both people slacklining. I don't do this, but it looks really cool. The one on the left, if they mess up, it's like a 1 foot drop, not a big deal. It takes the exact same skill set, exact same ability for the person on the right, but if they mess up, I don't know where this is. I don't know if it's even real, but it's like 1,000 foot drop. They've got a little leash on them. But degree of exposure. I felt this biking in Whitehorse, because, you know, at Kincaid, I biked all the little wood ramps, and they're like 6 inches off the ground. I'm like, oh yeah, I got this. And then I go to Whitehorse, and those ramps are like 10 feet off the ground. Same skill set, same balance, same bike. I'm like, That freaked me out. And it was a different degree of exposure, same hazard, degree of exposure. Exposure time, for me, this is an easy one in the whitewater world because some rapids are long and continuous and you're exposed for a long time if something goes wrong. And some are, they call them pool drop. Drop, you land in a pool, that's awesome. It's like this great zone of recovery. They can both be rated with the same difficulty, but one of them is a lot different in terms of exposure time. Do you use these terms?
So some of those terms overlap with mountain bike trail design, with the JQT, the BLM framework for how to design a trail. So I know exposure is in there, hazard is in there. So we do have a framework. It's but it's looking at the trail design.
Yeah.
That gives be interesting. Okay.
So take it or leave it, but I have benefited from adopting this terminology kind of rigorously. Vulnerability, our third container here, how likely, how harmful, and the things that really influence our vulnerability are our partners, like Sarah being with 2 EMTs, our equipment, our preparedness, our education. Make sense? This is a big container and it often gets either folded into exposure or folded into hazard in the outdoor sector specifically. For some reason, we don't talk vulnerability, but it is still in, like, my background more in environmental sciences, landslides to tsunamis and those analyses, vulnerability is still part of that conversation. I think it should be more part of our outdoor industry conversation, but it isn't for some reason. I don't know why. All good? I will give you a break, but you have to stay with me for 1 hour before you earn your break. So takeaway from this section, we have very little control over hazards, maybe no control if we're talking about environmental hazards. We do have some control over exposure and vulnerability. Will, can you give us an example from your world with come up with a mic?
Example. Without dragging you too much off on a tangent, I've always been curious about why we're debating poor decisions. And I think you said, well, they might find somebody who knows that, but I think there's probably a bunch of factors other than that. I wonder if you could speak to some of those, some of the psychological things. Because sometimes you have a group of very much, and they still do stuff.
Which is, so the question is, kind of going back to that example of a group of 8 being potentially as good at making decisions or receiving or observing as a group of 1. And going back to my first question, why does a group of 8 experts still get into trouble? And we see that over and over again. And the avalanche industry is, I think, one of the few where most incidents are happening to experts. That didn't used to be the case. I think 30 years ago, it was novice skiers that were getting caught. And today there are very few novice skiers getting caught in avalanches, and it's the experts. And if you look at South Central Alaska, right, 2 heli ski fatalities this year, 3 last year. And the guides themselves, I was just had dinner with another one, he had torn his ACL on a slide at work, you know, so it's like the experts are the ones getting in trouble. I'm not answering your question. We should crowdsource this because I'm not the only one that has ideas. For me, when I'm in a group of 8, I love turning off my brain. It is more pleasant for me to not have to think about what's going on, especially when I've got somebody that I think is super competent and be like, man, she's been guiding for 20 years and does this professionally. I'm going to have a candy bar while you figure out what we're going to do. Absolutely. I love being in that space. It's not fair to you. What else have you got? You've all been a group of 8, plus or minus. Okay. And B, yeah, that's okay.
The example that he mentioned from our season last year, a good example of that was basically a debate, that day, but I think because especially when you have a high level of competency, every person is assuming that someone else has got it covered, where there's a high level of trust in the group, and so there's less specific responsibility taken by each individual person because I know that the group leader is paying attention, well, I know that person's really good on the saw, and they're watching, and then this other person's good, they're right there. And we trust the person who's running the saw anyway, we know they make good decisions, they've got the judgment, and they've been trained. And so it's just sort of a slight passing of the buck to everyone, so that no one has taken like the full decision making.
Do you think it's worse that the group is 8 competent people instead of, say, a mix of some more experience and some less experience?
In our case, I think it was, because if we had had less competent people in the group, I think the field crew leader in that moment would have assumed the leadership and responsibility, but that person was attempting to empower the other people on the crew to be like, you don't need me to hover, like, you've got this, and you have been, kind of empowering them. And so I think the assumption was stepping away from work and practice, leadership, and so I think if there had been less competency, there would have, someone would have taken control and charge or decision making a little bit.
How weird is that, right? That more experience could bite us in the butt.
The culture of the group.
You,
Here within that,
you speak up just so.
here within that nearly range, the culture of the group was starting to shift towards unsafe, and that was become the new norm. And so everyone at the height of the spectrum is used to that level of culture, and that has become your baseline. But now you have several rules of cheese online. All it takes is one to set off an incident.
And I think that's especially likely to happen if it has been a long time since the last incident, right? We just get complacent.
I think she raises a good point, which is you're dealing with small groups that, quite frankly, like the individuals like each other. And that likeness results in an elevated false sense of trust, because the lower level people say, well, this person is the boss, they're a god. And the person who's in charge looks at them and say, they're a good person. None of these people want to, want to do something that would hurt each other. And as a result, that's a big hole in the cheese that's never really covered by me.
And so one way to solve that issue is to take sort of a military hierarchy, right? And I gave this similar workshop last month up at Fairbanks, Fort Wainwright. And those guys are like, the captain's like, I need my soldiers to do what I say. And I need them to not speak up and say this feels uncomfortable or whatever. So that is a solution. And then there's flaws with that. And it's like, this is a messy space. Let's do, background.
So the thing that I thought on this response that the ability to actually communicate with one person globally.
Good point.
More like zero voices to one effective voices.
That was a great addition. I had trouble hearing it, so I'll repeat it here. It's a lot easier to communicate with one person or with 2 people than with 8 people. If you have 8 voices all going, it can be hard to filter through. Let's finish with yours.
I was gonna say, in our world, like, a lot of us employ young people or people who are somewhere in their like mastery journey.
We call them soldiers.
And I think like ego and organizational culture around ego of not knowing, and like how acceptable it is to not know things and how acceptable it is to speak up. Like, I think having 8 experts is bad because you're like, everybody knows. But I think having people who are at a different level of their mastery journey and not necessarily wanting to expose where they are in their mastery journey, because we haven't created a space where they can say like, I don't think it's safe, but I know I'm not the expert in the room. I think can also lead to problems. Everyone was probably at some point the 20-year-old in your trail crew, or something you didn't want to necessarily expose the fact that you didn't know why that decision was made and you didn't know why you couldn't use that piece of equipment. And so I think in a group like that, You might have someone who actually has a little gut feeling about being and not normal, but doesn't have the culture to say why they feel that way, or the words to say why they feel that way. So I think like we, in our trail building, will specifically be like, deal a little bit of that, like ego culture. Speak about ability.
Perfect, yeah, and we'll come back to communication and some of what I've read about how to be effective as leaders in communication. Will, why don't you come up and give us your example?
Great, well, I was taking notes and closed the notepad, so I don't know what it's. I also was texting the people who are responsible for this with me while we were there, saying we need to do this, so. It is a trail building group, so I'll try to focus on trail building, but how many of you work with, let's say, mountain bike kids? Youth and mountain bikers, yeah, so, the number one, I am expecting injuries on the first night of our mountain bike program. So the hazards, the hazards there, number one, are impalement hazards, right? The bungee sticks. So that is something that we do with as trail builders and trail maintenance. We need to go clear those trails that we're going to be sending kids down, right? Because they are going to go off the trail. So wait, hazards. Hazards, number one, bungee sticks. We can maintenance, we can. Number two, exposure. So the exposure is allowing the kids to go there, right? So a few things that we try to do with exposure. And I don't know if this is the way you answered. One is you show up, you put your bikes down, right? So we actually remove that exposure by not allowing them to ride their bikes when they show up. They're not going around everywhere. Number two, when we do start them riding, they're riding in the field. So they're riding on the grass. And then number three, when they go out, it's very hard, but they will have to go with their groups before they're allowed on the trail. So that would be controlling the exposure, and then the vulnerability. Oh, how bad you're going to get hurt, right?
Well, and some of his exposure examples were also vulnerability. That's part of why outdoor sectors are so. I just lump those things together. But everything you said also made them less vulnerable to something going wrong. Being in a group, you're starting slow, ramping up, but other ways to reduce.
Well, the vulnerability is, the goal, the expectation of risk reward going into that vulnerability is, this is a fun activity. You're probably going to get hurt sometime. Our goal is broken arms, not broken necks. So,
I guess an easy example to reduce vulnerability would be to require padding.
oh,
And you might not need to, but you might look at the group, right, that says, wow, we're working with older folks now with brittle bones. And so maybe we reduce our organizational vulnerability by requiring padding.
so to reduce vulnerability, we don't require that, but we do require helmets. We do require closed-toe shoes.
And you brush your trails.
And
Try to remove hazard.
yeah, but that would be the physical part, right? Like the trails themselves. So the way I heard it was, we had the physical part, and then we had the exposure, which is where you're there, and then the vulnerability is kind of the injury to the individual. Still stuck on vulnerability. I'm gonna hand it back to Rick.
It's easy to get stuck in these spaces, and I would say that cleaning the trails probably reduces exposure. There are fewer of those hazards around. Padding reduces the vulnerability. It's okay to not be perfect with these. I just think it makes it easier to talk about. Even if it's to say, I don't really know if this is vulnerability or exposure, but hey, we're talking about clearing trails, we're talking about wearing helmets. Good, that's a win for me.
Exposure is something that happens. Not into it, and vulnerability is what increases the impact.
Yeah, yep, the consequences in that vulnerability bucket. By the definitions, exposure, especially from the environmental science standpoint, exposure is very simple. It's who and what. What is exposed? Kids are exposed. And then the outdoor sector is added. how long, what degree, but it can be as simple as kids and bikes. These are the things we're worried about. And then everything else lives in the vulnerability bucket. But within this space, we are all going to use these terms slightly different, and that's part of what makes it a little bit hard to talk about this stuff. I'm going to keep moving into our second sort of model within risk, and that's probability and consequence. The story I'll use to illustrate this is a ski trip to Mount Iliamna. And so planning a trip like this, either formally or informally, we make a list of what might go wrong. And that list could include things like a crevasse fall, and it could include things like blisters. And then for each of those, we make a plan. This is a picture of Mark, and he just popped through a crevasse. And that could be really scary, except for that we had identified it as something that could happen as a hazard. And we thought, we didn't use these words, but like, how can we reduce our vulnerability? Well, let's make sure we're roped up. Let's keep the rope tight. So when Mark broke through the crevasse, he was tight on the rope. He broke down to his waist. No big deal. He's all smiles. We get up and we keep rolling. Later in the trip, just like 2 days later, we had to cancel the trip and fly out because one of the guys got a really bad blister. And we knew that was an issue, a possibility. Like, has anybody here ever had a blister? It's like, yeah, you know this is going to happen. And because it is so common, we just sort of like, yeah, blister, whatever. That's what I thought. Even when I saw it, it's like, blister, whatever, dude. Like, let's keep moving. And part of what we messed up was that I really wanted this trip to happen, sort of no matter what, even if it was uncomfortable. But that's not what the other guys wanted. They're like, I thought this was going to be fun. I was like, well. So we did kind of a failure to communicate initially to talk about expectations. But it was a good lesson for me in this probability consequence space. How likely is it that there's going to be a crevasse fall? Very unlikely. How many of you have fallen into a crevasse? Okay, wrong group to ask that too. It could be a big deal, right? Not very likely. It could be pretty high consequence. The blister, you've all got the blisters. How big of a deal is that? It's usually not that big of a deal. So probability consequence, helpful, but a complicated way it can be a complicated way to explore this space. I bet you've all seen some form of this, like a risk matrix, where you try to quantify or qualify the likelihood, probability on one axis and the consequence on another. Where this gets messy is that I would put that crevasse fall in the lower right corner. I don't know how to hide that thing at the bottom. Yeah, you want to try? Right, crevasse fall is not very likely, but it could be a big deal. And I'm going to put the blister in the upper left corner. It's pretty likely to happen, and it's not that big of a deal. And those both get the same, oh, thanks, perfect. Those both get the same numerical value, 5. And I think that's misleading because I think those are really different experiences. So I think it's more helpful to think about this space in terms of these quadrants. The green and the red kind of match our like normal, not normals. It's like if something is likely to happen and it's not a big deal, it's like, great, let's go for it. If something's very likely to happen and it's a very big deal, it's like there's a group of 6 grizzlies eating a moose carcass. Let's go over there and also eat the moose carcass. It's like, yeah, that's an easy decision, easy no. And so the hard spot here is trying to play within these learning zones and scary zones. Learning zones are things that are almost certainly going to go wrong. But it's just not that big of a deal. It's Will taking those kids out on bikes. They're probably going to fall over, and somebody's probably going to have a little bit of an injury by the end of the day, and hopefully it's a bumps and a bruise. And then the scary zone is stuff like a bunch of the avalanche problems, where it's just not that likely to happen, but if it does, man, it's a big deal. So I don't like that those can be given the same color or the same numerical value. For me, it's a little bit more helpful to think of sort of learning and scary or danger and discomfort. This is going to be a little bit uncomfortable, but it's not dangerous. Where this is going to be pretty dangerous. Questions on this? Okay, so Will already gave us an example. Thanks. But I think if this is useful to you, you might take a note to do some of this within your organization. Just force yourself to use these words: hazard, exposure, vulnerability, probability, consequence. in the hopes that that might help communication down the road.
And maybe everyone uses this a lot, but I find it really helpful if you're thinking about mitigating risk. You're either reducing the likelihood of it happening, or you're reducing the chance if it does happen.
Awesome. We're trying to drive down into that green zone. Good, that's a great addition. Christine?
Not to account for things, that seem manageable in states, but change over time. And I'm thinking of the time that I had to work climb the cluster. And it seemed like this can't be, and also it was possibly and it's really low symptom right feet, that it became a likely infection. But I'm gonna know how to account for that. When you just call it the blister, you know what I mean?
I think where this model fails is that we're somewhere in that continuum between learning zone, scary zone, upper left, lower right. So what you're saying is like, where am have I entered scary or am I still in learning? So that's where I am challenged with this. Like, very rarely is it so obvious. Well, sometimes it's really obvious that the consequences are just not that big of a deal. And I love those opportunities. For me, that's ice skating on thin ice over inches of water. It's like, yeah, it's gonna break and it's just not gonna be that big of a deal. But most of the time it's like, well, how thin is the ice? How deep is the water? And so then I'm somewhere in that space between learning and scary. So there isn't an easy, it's probably experience, which we'll talk about here in a second. Trying to build more experience about it. When is this blister a big deal?
And consequences aren't static, and consequences are cascading.
Yeah.
Like they can become more consequential.
Okay, so we're gonna transition to the next topic here. These are both systems, hazard, exposure, vulnerability, probability, consequence of assessing risk. And then we're gonna make these decisions, go, no go, based on this blister. That's largely a function of our tolerance. So our next topic here is risk tolerance. The story I'll use to introduce this is I went down to Montana for a course this winter, and while I was there, I had a little side trip to go ice skating. And so it's super warm there. It's like 40 degrees. And I'm with a group I don't know. I'm in an area I don't know. We're on thin ice, and it's like I'm just a little bit uncomfortable. And we go out, and the group is just fine flying along. I'm also the biggest guy of the group, and I'm getting quite a bit of cracking just naturally under my own weight. And we keep going because I'm like, they're the experts, they know. And I really I do believe they are experts in that area. But I just kept getting these little warning signs where it's like, I'm pushing it. And if I was on my own, I wouldn't be doing this. Why am I doing it with this group? Even so, it took me about 45 minutes before I said, I'm beyond my comfort zone here, and I'm going to turn back. And they're like, oh, but we're right around the corner from where it gets better. And I was like, boy, that was tempting. I did some of my tests. And it was hard to do, but I gave myself a big pat on the back because this is hard to do, especially with a group you don't know, and be like, man, this isn't the right day for me. I'm going to turn back. Then they ended up turning back, and we went to an area with thicker ice, and it was great and less adventurous for them, but it was the right decision for me. So the backdrop, what was going on in my brain is that I had this list of normal and not normal conditions. I can say it's normal for me to be on 4 inches of ice. It's not normal for me to be on 2 inches of ice. It's not normal for me to be on ice when it's 40 degrees out, or to not know how I would walk out if I had to. And I have little tests that I do with a probe where I like strike the ice, and if I can strike it twice and it doesn't break through, and like, oh, it'll hold me. And so I have all of these ways to evaluate, like, where am I within normal and not normal? The kinds of cracks that I can form when I put all my weight on one foot and flex on. It's like, these are all little tests I have. And for whatever reason that day, I was able to recognize, like, I'm in this fuzzy zone in between these things, and my tolerance today is get the heck out. Just, it's a group I don't know, it's an area I don't know. It's just too many factors, too many gaps maybe in my Swiss cheese model. And that even popped in my head, and I was like, oh, it's working. I'm actually remembering one of these models like on the fly. It's so much easier to do this on the computer than it is to do this out there in the woods, right? So this is a concept, and it's in the textbooks about organizational risk tolerance.
the idea of presenting what is normal and not normal for your organization. And what this often looks like are cutoff values. When I was working with the soldiers last month, we don't go out when it's below -40. It's like, great, that's a nice, easy cutoff. Like -39.9, they go out. -40.1, they don't go out, but it's like, it's there, and it's really helpful to have that. For me, that might be, I don't go out when the ice is less than 2 inches or whatever. But this really should come from leadership, organizational leadership, and presented in a way, communicated in a way that reaches the rest of the organization. So some organizations are making an effort not just to put it in writing, but also to make videos, also have conversations, because we learn and remember things differently depending on those mediums. Make sense? This, I think, is hugely relevant for everybody here. You're part of an organization. If this doesn't exist, it should exist. Some sense from above, whether that's you or your employer, for what's normal and what's not normal within your organization. There's also a flavor of personal risk tolerance, and I had Sarah Glaser illustrate this for the Packraft book, an evolution of our willingness for things to go wrong. This goes back a little bit to what we were talking about, I can't remember when. If there hasn't been an incident for a long time, we're probably more likely or willing to let something go wrong than if something bad just happened last week. I mean, I give an example with Dylan's death. You know, I bet that the heli company that he works for snapped back, and all of a sudden they are less willing to take risks than they were before that incident, right? And for good reason. Like, these are good responses. In case you can't read the text here, what Sarah's got is she's more and more tolerant as she gets into boating, and then her professor's son dies on a boating outing. And because of her proximity to him, her mentor, her willingness for things to go wrong plummets. And then she gets into pack rafting, hurts her shoulder, and then she tries this and that, and kind of this sawtooth pattern. And for most people, this pattern takes a big jump when they start families, and a slow curve down when they get old. Good on this? This is a fun exercise to do. We're not going to do it, but you might want to plot one of these up for yourselves. It's something I do in other workshops. Okay, so our takeaway from this block, things often go wrong in the space between normal and not normal. So I want to get better at both shrinking that space and identifying, like, what does it feel like to be in that space? One way to shrink it is to be really clear about those cutoff values. We do this in these conditions, we don't do this. And that might feel limiting, and there might be a difference between how you take things personally versus take things organizationally. If I'm working with kids, I want this stuff to be really well defined. I want to limit that nearly normal zone, pinch it down as much as I can. Yes.
Stated that relevant in our industry is that the trail building at its very nature is almost entirely not. Like, there isn't a replicable Ardeo, which looks like this. There may be micro exposures like, you know, for fully low it's for 24 and 5%. So we all know now the normal class from season level, day level. So there is anything to say to that?
Yeah, that's a great point. What Christine is highlighting, that there isn't really a well-defined normal in field work. And that's part of this being a complex environment. So I think what you are tasked to do as the leader of your organization is, and maybe it's done by role modeling, is to convey to the rest of your team what risks you're willing to take as an organization. And if they see you willing to do some sawing without your PPE, that's what they're going to assume is okay. And if they say, whoops, nope, we full stop. So it might not be as simple as a list of blueberry jam on Tuesdays. It's like, this is how willing I am for things to go wrong. And I get to say so because I'm the boss. And then empowering your staff to make those decisions with all the weird variables that come in, because they're not gonna get the exact example that you highlighted, and say, what would Christine do? We'll stop. Does that help?
Maybe what gave you to learn.
I think getting mixed messages from you would be a risk to the organization. So I think it'd be more important, it would be of value to get on the same page and convey that.
Our behalf, we did a risk management training for our company last year, and we've been, developing a management plan for a long growth. But we realized we have a gap in identifying really what is driving the forward. And so this conversation is super relevant, but it really should be for everybody in the room. If they don't have that established formally, then you are with yourself with a lot of natural trade organization, like legally and also just and that's important thing. If you think you know, and no, if it hasn't been stated.
I think normal could also be like very basic. Like for our example, we run 5-person crews that work 10-hour days that have a crew leader and 4 crew members. So if they're out there on the 12th hour, that's not normal. If the crew leader's sick that day, and it's just 4 crew members without their leader, that's not normal. And so that doesn't mean like they don't work that day, but it just means like, what do we do to mitigate not normal?
Perfect. It doesn't mean full stop. It means like, hey, we just need to change our risk management plan. This is, I was gonna ask Joey for this, like, do you have examples of normal and not normal within your organization? I put you on the spot, because I didn't give you any time to prepare. But that was a perfect example. Can you think of anything to add?
Great, well, let's start with AT trail. This is
Fourth day.
Do you, okay, this is perfect, actually. Do you have no, it's gonna be too hard. I was gonna say, do you have a sense for what's normal and not normal?
go back to like, 12 hour, or I can go. Like most of the moment get hurt, probably the end of the season, I'm trying to go fast on Friday, and I want to, take a shower, beer, like that, go last an hour. People are looking, around. That is a big, it feels like I was home, I should be, like, throughout the week. I think I'll go to the exhaustion.
Let me try, this would be fun. Do you expect to have a regular lunch break, or do you expect to snack throughout the day when you're on your shift?
Race, hours.
Do you, are you required to have your own first aid kit, or is there one within, like, that the leader has?
Leader.
Okay, so these are all things conveyed in the onboarding process, and this is a great example. Like, Joey has a sense for what's normal and not normal without having started his job through the onboarding process. And it would be really valuable, or maybe this is a stretch, be really valuable to then identify what was different than what I expect, and to then communicate that up to leadership to say, like, I know we're supposed to be doing this, but it turns out we are always out of time on Friday afternoons, and so we end up rushing and we skip our lunches on Friday afternoons. Because that, again, is that fuzzy space where things are most likely to go wrong, where leadership says, this is normal, this is what we expect, and field staff is like, this isn't actually what we do. Yeah.
I like software or other applications, our risk management worksheet is like a binder.
Yeah.
So like to go through all of that every time and go out, and for me, I've done a lot of work solo. It's kind of like a lot of work, but kind of an easier way of going to risk on a daily basis, some simple checklists. That's not the whole risk management worksheet that's taking 2 hours to complete a monthly work every day on how it's free.
Yeah, I feel like we were learning this a little bit last year with interior trails, where it's like, there should be a really nice resource, a reference, a binder to go through, but it'd be really good to have some field guides that are like, quick and easy, how do I make decisions, especially if things go wrong, like a critical response. Like, you don't want to have to flip through that document and be like, who am I supposed to call? You want to have little cheat sheets that Christine is showing up. So I agree. I am getting more and more thorough with my planning, but I'm building a longer and longer document that is not that helpful. And there's probably a sweet spot in there that we're all probably gonna do some pendulation and be too brief and too, what's the opposite of brief? Verbose, thank you.
David, I think it's interesting that normally can vary within an organization, like. Mike and I here work with volunteers for lots of trails, and then we've got appropriates. As an example of how that may differ is, if you know it's gonna pour down rain, then you've got wind, that could fit with the normal appropriate, but regardless how you think you're volunteers. To me, that's not within the normal, it's because somebody's gonna show up without the proper clothing, and they're gonna get scared and not dangerously cold and wet and et cetera, so I think that one can. There is someone.
Yeah, great example, and I think the point would be, if that isn't already documented, it should be. When I'm working with volunteers, when I'm working with youth, these are my new sets of normal and not normal. When I'm working with pros, these are my expectations. That's totally reasonable. And it probably all lives in somebody's brain. And a bunch of what IT was trying to do last year was like, can we get this out of our brains so that everybody else has access to it?
I guess, I was just thinking, this, kind of goes without experience in this, for years. I work with safety management.
Yeah.
Everybody, we did generate safety management, and it's like listed. But a lot of that manual's desktop exercise for you, we go through every task, so this is very, with pro building. We could probably all agree to say 5 tasks. Time, or hand tools, or equipment. And as you're doing that, there's only 5 things. But, that's like your desktop exercise. But then we go pointing around for leaders, taking that sheet and started it. Like, it's our baseline. Okay, today we're chainsaws. We're all going to chainsaws. And go on the baseline training, right? But today, this would be 5 or 4, whatever, basically, I was like, well, what is it today? Starting today, then you go through what was different. I guess it increases your involved because you're already on the desk, right? On the world with desk, but you got books, weather, somebody's made some bad tacos last night, and their mind's elsewhere, it's such a thing very big. And oftentimes we find here that both like, hey, he's focused our plan this morning, we're thinking to lay out, that all this got cost up. Expires and big 5, big 3.
That's perfect. And my forward summary is that, again, having that like massive reference needs to contain some smaller bite-sized pieces that are accessible so that we can make decisions on the fly. The Coast Guard talks about this as deliberative planning in real time. And that's another good take home for organizations. I'm going to reward you with a break after this question.
Mention that sometimes making the right decision isn't as impactful of a learning opportunity as if something has gone wrong.
Yeah.
So like when you make the decision to turn back skiing or ice skating, there might have been people that group that thought they're really not big of a deal if we could have made it for love. And if they had continued on without you, somebody had fallen through, then it would have preferred in the right decision. But oftentimes you don't get confirmation that you made the right decision. Because there's not really that impactful learning opportunity. So I don't know, finding ways to highlight those moments that could be making decisions, like enough factors lined up for me to make the right call for me or my crew or whatever. And still having those conversations, even when nothing went wrong.
This is a perfect segue into the next section, which is about experience and learning from experience and when that works and when that doesn't work. And we had a good example already where it's like a group of 8 experienced people, and that might be a little bit of a disadvantage. It's really, yeah, this stuff in complex environments, it can be really hard to learn. And I want those learning opportunities, and we need to make mistakes to learn. But it'd be awesome if every time I made a mistake to turn around, something catastrophic happened. I just talked to a guy who got an email, and he's like 4 for 4 for turning around and then having an avalanche happen right where my group was about to go. I want to have a conversation with that guy.
Cause he's getting the feedback, and he's like, I am crushing it. But there's probably some risk there of being like, I am so good at this.
You always make the right call.
I always make the right call, and that's absolutely where I was leading up to my avalanche. Like I was doing really well at not getting caught in avalanches until I got caught. Last one, and then we do breaker.
I was just gonna, yours, the, like, yeah, you're gonna learn from those catastrophic mistakes or those micro mistakes. But, I was gonna say, it's always nice when you give everybody the space to, like, make the small mistakes and share them with everybody, with zero consequence. So like if you, like, you've been, I can't even think of an example, like, not on the spot, but, yeah, like, just something small and minor, like, not punishing somebody for it, even if it was against the rules, but like, hey, let's speak up and share this with everybody, like, okay, like, this is why we, I don't know, give people space, when we're using brush card. Like, yeah, so we can all learn from it, but if you goof, you're afraid to get in trouble, then I mean, maybe you learned that lesson, but you didn't give the opportunity to everybody. Now somebody or everybody else might make that same mistake. So.
Good. We will also talk about mistakes. These are both of your comments will feed really well into what I've got planned for the second block. So take your break. I would request that you keep it as short as possible. So I got a bunch more I want to do.
Go quick. Makes sense.
Was it that improved that?
Yeah, so yes, Will's talking about. Your time for just your time, right?
That's fine. You did. I want to talk about the headlights. Right on.
Good. How are you? Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I think they may only realize because the town, but I started, I stacked up.
Yeah.
But it was so much. I really can't cry. But person that took responsibilities, I live there.
Yeah.
If they're volunteer, they're probably similar to these.
Yeah.
This is a bad. And if they're not, if this is for the season. I just wonder whether those limits of availability, little holy keys, or whether they increase to complicate that. But.
Great question.
I don't
Okay.
I say this.
The leader part of this is- Yeah, okay.
Because one needs to hurt family. Because it's not serious. At least already.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Okay. Some of us, some-
No, I was just saying.
Yeah.
I didn't turn it here.
Could allow organizations that they give a little bit of free rein. That's a good point.
Yeah, anyway, I just.
That's a good- All right. Okay, let's do it. Okay, so we're gonna move into a new topic. It feeds well into the last couple of questions or comments. Ready? Let's talk about experience. And we've already touched on this a little bit so far, so we'll just dive a little bit deeper. How does experience influence our assessment and our decision making? And we have quite a bit of data that, for examples, I should say, where despite experience, we still make mistakes. The professionals, the guides, the instructors still getting caught. And for me, if I go back to my ICE example, I had that list of normals and not normals, whether it was thickness or sound or cracks, because when I go out, I take all the opportunities I can to play and experiment, run little experiments. Like I want to skate on that thin ice so that I know what those cracks are like. If I'm only going to break through and get my feet wet, great. That's an awesome learning opportunity for me. That's up in that quadrant of the learning experience. It's almost certain I'm going to break through the ice. It's just not that big of a deal if I do. So when I'm out doing a lot of this, like my nose is on the ice, I'm looking at cool textures and patterns. And through that experience, through collecting those experiences, I've built a fairly robust list of normals and not normals. And that's subconscious. I don't have it written down, but does that make sense? So the question is like, yeah, obviously we need experience to get better at making those decisions, but experience can also bite us in the butt. So how do we make peace with that? And what I'm going to do is just show you a bunch of concepts that stuck with me as far as feeling useful in this space. They might not stick with you. The first one is perceived ability. I bet so you've heard of this concept of idiot's mountain, like the Dunning-Kruger effect. It's a little bit misleading because that's not something they ever created, it just gets credited to them. But the researchers here, Dunning and Kruger, what they did is they had access to a bunch of undergraduates, they're taking English classes,
And they surveyed the students on things like their humor, their logic, and their grammar, and then quantified self-assessment versus group assessment. So if we're doing it for humor, it's like, how funny do you think you are versus how funny do we all think you are? And across the board here, there, again, I know, don't get too caught up in the graphs, but the outcome here was that we all over assess our ability. We all think we're better at these things than we are. And it's not saying that I think I'm funnier than you. It just means I think that I'm funnier than what everybody else thinks. Okay, so kind of across the board, at least within this sort of undergraduate academic setting, when we are new to an activity, we think we are better at it than we are. I'm bringing this up in terms of experience because you don't have much experience yet. And what these guys showed, where these two curves cross, that's a space where people that actually have the most experience or were considered the funniest within the group, their self-assessment was below that. I said, I'm actually not that funny. Everybody else is like, man, they're actually hilarious. So with experience, those folks were more likely to underestimate their ability. Make sense? Take it or leave it. I just think, oh, it's kind of cool. There's some data behind it, and I like data. Next up is thinking about intuition. And there's a model, and it's a mouthful, so don't worry about it. Recognition primed decision model. The research here is by this guy named Gary Klein, and he interviewed firefighters to try to figure out how do they make these decisions when it's like a crisis mode, you don't have any time, you got to make a decision fast. And going into this study, what he anticipated is that the decision-making process would look something like what I did before applying to colleges, which is like I had a column for each college and I did my pros and cons. What's going to be good here, what's going to be bad, and through that sort of eliminated, got my top pick, yeah, let's do that. What Gary Klein found with these interviews is that the firefighters were snapping to one solution based on their, he calls it intuition, but really it's their learned experience. They would snap to a solution, and then they would run a mental model for how that would work. And if the mental model failed, they would abandon that and move to a new solution. So there was no comparison, but it was just like, based on what I've seen already, this is what I think we should do. Run it, run it, run it. Yeah, that worked. Let's do it. Does that make sense? This is a big point, and what I like about this is that I bet you have all experienced this at some point, whether it's in a relationship or work or whatever, where it's like, you have an intuitive sense for what should happen. Like, boom, this is what we should do. And there was some nice research, and if you're interested in these references, I can give them to you afterwards. But I like this, that idea of like your intuition feeds your plan. In this case, they had only time to really make one good plan. And the stories were like, they go into a building and there's fire, there's a little bit of weird smoke coming out the door, and all of a sudden the fire chief is like, get out of the building. They all get out, and then the roof collapses. And then they ask the fire chief, why did you say get out of the building? It's like, I just had a bad feeling about it. It's like, I just got this sense that we should. It's like, well, where did that come from? Came from learned experience. Another concept in this space, going to your comment, sort of about learning environments, some other researchers introduced this concept of kind and wicked learning environments. I think, again, this is probably familiar to some of you, but not all. The kind learning environment is one that gives you all the feedback you need. The author uses tennis. He's a tennis player. I don't play tennis, so that's not super helpful for me. But another example would be chess, where it's like, you know what each one of those pieces can do, and you see where they all are. There's nothing hidden. So you play an opponent and you know every possibility. Like if you had time to run a computer program to play out every possible move, you could. All the pieces are there. That's a kind learning environment. You mess up, you get feedback. Your pawn dies. You mess up, you get feedback. As opposed to a wicked learning environment, which has either incomplete feedback or misleading feedback. And a good example of that is poker, where you don't know all the cards in your opponent's hands, or the card that's going to come up next in the deck. There's a lot hidden. You don't know the tolerance of your opponents. I don't play chess or poker, so these are all kind of a stretch for me. What's not a stretch for me is the avalanche world is a wicked learning environment. I can get down the slope over and over and over again. whether or not I had made good assessments about the slope stability. And then I can get caught. When I get feedback, it's wicked. It's a big deal. That's where that term's coming from. Questions on this? I think this is a cool concept because it helps explain why don't we always learn from our mistakes. This author, his book is called The Myth of Experience. It's like experience isn't always going to help us make those good decisions. Christine?
It reminds me of the quote, judgment comes from experience, and experience comes from that.
Yeah.
It's possible whether intuition came from bad judgments or inverting.
That's a great question. Yeah, that's a great question. I don't remember from the book if they talked about mistakes. I think really they just emphasize like whoever's seen the most was the best at making a quick intuitive judgment. But that's a great question about learning from mistakes. Okay, so kind and wicked learning environments. The more people involved, the more complex the environment, the more wicked it will be. Here's another concept in this space, situational awareness. What I want with experience is I want to build situational awareness. And I've had this a few times in my river courses, and it's so rewarding where I see somebody doing something up the river and I recognize it. And I say, they're gonna run into trouble. Let's just get down here so we can help them. And we do, and they run into trouble and we're like right there ready to pluck them out of the water. It is so awesome when that happens. And so this researcher, I think she was the chief scientist for the Air Force or something. She spent a bunch of time sort of researching situational awareness, and she came up with this hierarchy where the base level is perception. We see something in the environment. So that could be a little bit of smoke, or that could be wind drift, snow blowing off a ridge top. The next level of situational awareness is comprehension and sort of understanding and putting that concept into a bigger picture. Like, oh, there's snow blowing on that ridge. Maybe there's a wind slab forming up. And then the final tier here, the target that I think we all want is projection. And that's where we could say, take that wind slab building and say, gosh, in a couple hours, that slope might be dangerous. So it's moving forward. Or my example on the river, but seeing some activity up here by a paddler and projecting that they're going to run into trouble and end up right here. I want this badly in everything I do. I want to get so good at situational awareness that I can pick this stuff up on the peripheries and put myself in the right position to help if I'm in a rescue course, or just to do right if I'm at work. Does this make sense? I know these are all sort of abstract concepts, but I like them. They've been useful to me. So we can chat about this since it's come up a few times, but my takeaway here is that experience builds this situational awareness, that ability to project, but only if the feedback is accurate, so we're in a kind learning environment. And if we take the time to reflect or debrief on it or share it. We've talked about it, and we brought up like sharing those experiences with the group. Is there anything you want to add with your experience with experience? Christine?
Talked about this before, but the one that we used to boil down those 3 points in the field that's a little bit less heavy is I see, I understand, I predict. So we run that through every new task, sawing, commuting, or whatever. Those are the questions we ask that now, so they don't go to more time. We're not real one. But that's in ask that in time. Whether it's you see the bears and folks or you river tires, cross, whatever.
Yeah, I'll just say it into the mic in case people hear. Instead of using these sort of longer words, Christine likes, I see, I understand, I predict. Same concepts. All good. I'm going to keep going so I'm not going to have you come up with an example, but if these exercises have been useful, you might make a note to do some of this within your organization. What aspects of your work environment are kind? What gives you the feedback that you need, and what aspects are wicked? What are things that are always going to work out unless if they don't work out, it's catastrophic?
Where are you missing feedback? Where might you be getting irrelevant feedback? Does anybody have one off the top of their head? This is hard for me not knowing, not having done trail curriculum. In general, kind learning environment, you get the feedback you need when you're out there. That would be my guess.
Last year, we had a crew working on drainage and girder. It was a pretty kind learning environment. They were daily reminded of whether or not their drainage features, whilst they were building a trail,
Oh, nice.
were functional.
Perfect.
Yeah,
Oh, that's awesome. A drainage been girdled because it's wet.
yeah.
And so you can see if your work yesterday worked, and if not, you're like, oh, whoops, we needed to build that site up more.
Yeah.
Awesome. So, and then, yeah, perfect. I bet we could come up with a counterexample, but. Okay, let's transition to the next block here. We had some examples of this already, even with a bunch of experience, even the people that are most prepared are still making mistakes. So experience doesn't eliminate mistakes, just changes when they happen, where they happen. So our next block here is to think more about mistakes. The point is that we are always going to make mistakes. This is part of our human nature. It's like to err is human. And so we're moving from a framework of perfection, of fail-safe performance, to a space where it is safe to fail, where we can afford to make mistakes because we reduce their consequences, we anticipate their consequences. My example here is my friend Rob in the photo, drowned on the Tana River during one of the Wilderness Classics. And it's easy to say, man, Rob made a mistake, or Rob's that domino we should pluck out. But there's a lot behind the scenes. They had just walked around the Tana Canyon of the Class 4 Canyon, technical canyon. They just walked around the whole thing, which took like 6 hours, brutal walking. So they recognized that hazard. They said, man, we are not gonna mess with this Class 4 water. And they did the right thing by walking all the way around it into Class 2 water. They've had a bunch of Class 2 water before. Had PFD, 2 partners, it wasn't by himself, so we did all these things right. And then maybe it's again our Swiss cheese model. And the point wouldn't be to assume that Rob is never going to capsize. We're not going to plan for perfection. The point is to think, when you tip, what are we going to do about it? And I wasn't there, and I don't know what they did and what they could have done differently. But this is a personal example for me. It's like, I'm going to mess up. What are we going to do about it when that happens? And things are going to go wrong on your ditch. What are you going to do about it? How do you reduce those consequences? The resource that I found most useful for this, thinking about mistakes, is a field of study called human and organizational performance. And we'll go through the 5 points of this. The take-home message for me is, 1, that mistakes are going to happen. And 2 is that I'm trying to reframe my mind when I see on the news or social media or something, an accident, a fatality. When I was younger, I would snap to sort of like, what were they thinking? Holy cow, why would they be doing that in May? Whatever. And so it's a shift from that mindset to, why did that make sense? These were probably smart, experienced people. Why did that make sense for them to be out there that day? We'll come back to it. So the first of these 5 concepts, error is normal. So this is just back to, like, by default, as humans, we are gonna make mistakes. And rather than build a workplace where you assume perfection and you punish people that make mistakes, it's like, yep, probably could have seen that happen. We're gonna make mistakes. Blame fixes nothing. So this author, Todd Conklin, has this great line that says, we can either learn from this experience or we can blame. It's one or the other. You don't get to do both. So you can either say, man, Rob messed up. Rob shouldn't have been anywhere near that word. But nobody benefits from that. It doesn't help prevent the next incident. So blaming or learning from it. What could he have done differently? How could we have supported it differently? Should there have been some equipment requirements for people on this course? Any of those decisions? Third point here is context drives behavior. Again, this is coming from that manufacturing sector. And so they're trying to figure out, like, why does Josh keep messing up? And it's like, well, maybe Josh is,
every Friday he has to skip lunch, so he's coming in, he's not thinking as clearly, and there's this pressure from above, from the organization. It's really a way to take the pressure off the personal mistake and say, how did we fail to support this worker? Sure, they messed up, Joey messed up, but how did I fail to prepare him for this experience? He thought he was gonna be having a snack every 15 minutes. He actually just gets one break at 4 o'clock, whatever. Context drives behavior. 2 more of these. Learning is essential. This one's, I like this, it's pretty intuitive. It's like the point as an organization is that we need to learn to improve. And we want all of our team members to be on board with that. It's not just about productivity or finishing the project, it's about learning and becoming a better organization. And then the last one here is how we respond matters. So how leadership would respond to an incident matters. I was at Red Dog a couple of weeks, Red Dog Mine, and these guys told me about, I was working with some of the folks in the environmental department. And I don't know when, but let's say 10 years ago, when there were reported spills, they got less of a bonus in their paychecks. So it's like, okay, so there were not very many spills that were reported. It's like, why would you report a spill if you're gonna get paid less? And then somebody realized like, this is not working. So they changed the policy and it's like, you report a spill and you still get the bonus. And all of a sudden there were a lot more spills. But it's like, if leadership is gonna, pluck Josh from the line or say, oh, you need some remedial training. Let's take you over here and show you how to tie your shoelaces again. It's like, that doesn't inspire confidence, that doesn't inspire open space communication. As opposed to coming and saying like, man, how did we fail you? Like, right, we shouldn't dock your bonuses just because you reported something to us. So part of that shift is the workspaces that say, they got the Homer Simpson thing in the bottom, 3 days without an accident. Like these workspaces, like nobody wants to speak up and say it. At Red Dog, it was like 250,000 man hours without an incident. It's like, who's the guy that's gonna say like, I sprained my ankle, like let's just set that down to 0. Not gonna happen. Questions on these? I know I'm going fast and it might feel abstract, but this has been a really helpful resource for me to shift into this space that it's like, plan for the mistake, that yes, mistake, it's gonna happen. And a lot of those mistakes we're gonna learn from, that's gonna be awesome. And the key is to just make sure that when that bad thing happens, when this guy gets a blister, we've communicated well enough to like catch it early, take the day off, like glucotape, whatever that is, so we can reduce the consequence and keep moving forward. Anything you want to add on this? Human and organizational performance. Mistakes are gonna happen. Let's do it.
I can't quote. Plan is everything, plan is not.
Nice.
Which for us was like, we have to do all the planning. I like the one, but that way, then make it switch to like the next plan here. Well, let's just get fun and quote by now.
So again, we're not going to do this for the time we have left, but if this feels useful to you, you might think about where these principles are already being done well within your organization and maybe where they're not. Error is normal, blame fixes nothing, context drives behavior, learning is essential, how we respond matters. And I can give you that reference if you're interested. It's a short book. Okay, so we're going to transition in the next block, decision-making guidelines that can help us reduce those consequences. So maybe in this picture, it's like, we just commit ahead of time. If the waterfall is greater than 12 feet, we're going to walk around it. Awesome, that makes things easy. We can separate the decision-making tools into a couple categories, one before the action and one during the action. I've been playing around with these different tools over the last probably decade, and I'll try things in the field. I'll see what sticks, what do I actually do? And I'm starting with what is actually most useful to me. And it's this concept of identifying kill criteria ahead of time. And that's the term that the author Annie Duke uses. But another way to express this is with the Ulysses contract.
And this is based on the part of the epic where Ulysses is sailing by the islands with the sirens, and the sirens can like eat them or something. I don't remember all the details. But Ulysses really wants to hear the sirens' song, right? They're singing, and that attracts him to the island. There's a bunch of rocks. Y'all know the story probably better than I do. The ships could smash on the rocks, and then the sirens would eat their brains. So Ulysses says, I really want to hear this song. He puts wax in the ears of all the sailors, and he gets tied to the mast, and he says, if you see me trying to get free, just tighten the knots. So he's making a pre-commitment. I don't know why he wants to hear the song so badly, but he's making a plan ahead of time. Like the hazard is the siren song. He's going to be exposed to it. Really wants to hear the song. And he sets this all up ahead of time so that they can sail through without getting pulled toward the rocks. For me, some actual kill criteria that I can use for my river courses, I can say, I'm not going to teach at Eagle River when the gauge is above 7 or when the gauge is below 3, something like that. I have these cutoff values, and I have my little decision tree that says, at this value, I go to this place instead. That's super easy, and it's really helpful for me to have that predefined. Normal, not. It would not be normal for me to work at Eagle River when it's at 7.2, whatever. Does that make sense? I've given you some examples of like, we don't go out when it's below -40. I think as many of these that you can build into your organization, the better. Another example is that with my wife, Sarah, she said, pretty soon into our relationship, she said, you aren't allowed to go paddling by yourself. I was like, okay, I get that. And I know the numbers. I know that's the worst statistic is solo paddling. It's like, that's smart. That's a good cutoff, good criteria. It says, you aren't allowed to go out by yourself. If I do, and I have, it has to be an exceptional reason. I have to really justify it. Maybe it's that I'm going way down my skill level. Or maybe it's I'm going down to help in a rescue effort. Like, these are the times I cheat. There's a kid down the river, I might go do that. But I really want to justify it. Questions on this? Let's look at the next one. Gary Klein, the same guy that interviewed the firefighters, he came up with this idea of a pre-mortem. And it's another way to think of it as just what would the headlines say. So my story with this is, I think some of you already heard it. My wife and I did a trip on the north side of the Alaska Range where we're hiking with pack rafts, and all the rivers there are flowing to the north, where we're going to cross the Grange. So we have to cross all these glacial rivers one after another, like several days apart. And the crossings are pretty hard. It's like fast glacial water, big boulders. And on the final crossing that we did, it was like, we just barely made it. And I'm good at this. I do this for work. She's behind me in my eddy, and I've got trekking poles up front, and like the water was up over my hands. It was just like, man, it was touchy. We got to the other side, and it's like, that was so dumb. And I wish I had done this beforehand. I wish we'd been on the other bank, run this pre-mortem, or what would the headlines say? And because for me, that headline would have said something like, Swiftwater safety instructor and wife drowned while carrying pack rafts across a river. It's like we had them right there. We had everything we needed to get in our boats and just paddle across this thing. But it's like, oh, I'm good at wading, and it's gonna be faster and our stuff won't get wet. Let's just wade across. The term pre-mortem that's coming from, it's like a post-mortem, bunch of doctors in the room, and they say, oh, here's what went wrong. Here's why you died. But you didn't get to hear that. Everybody else got to hear that. So it's like, let's have that conversation ahead of time. Why is this project going to fail? What's going to go wrong? So it's forecasting. Questions on this? This is another tool that I can actually do. Like, there's a bunch of tools I think that's going to be really useful, but this one I've actually used, and the kill criteria I actually use. During action, if I'm out there on a riverbank, on a ridge top, this is where I can run through a checklist. The Avalanche School teaches this like 5-point checklist. It's sort of like, what's the problem between here and there? We need to adjust our travel technique. What could go wrong? They run through this checklist, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's a lot of documentation on the value of checklists. I'm sure you're all familiar with those. Another useful thing within the human factor space, and maybe some of you have heard of heuristics. These are mental shortcuts that we make, and they're actually really helpful for us, like getting through everyday life, but they can get us in trouble too. Anybody not familiar with heuristics? Okay, so I won't go into more detail there.
The problem with heuristics is that they happen automatically. They are, like by default, they are mental shortcuts. It's like we don't think through it. And so there isn't a lot of value in getting better at like naming all 23 heuristics because they just happen automatically. The trick is to try to catch the conditions where we might make those. So there's a researcher coming out of Utah who suggested this idea of personal disaster flags. And the idea here is through the debriefing, through the conversations you have with your friends or coworkers at the end of the day, identifying the traps that you often fall into. So for myself, I'm super goal oriented, like especially when I was younger. Holy cow! I gave you the example of the guy with the blister. I'm like, this doesn't have to be fun. We can still finish the trip, right? Like we can finish this trip. So when I recognize that and I go out with a new group, I can say, man, Haley, I am super goal oriented. And if you see me do this, if you see me get my like blinders on, let me know. Like hit the pause button. So some of this is like know thyself, but the point is you all probably have some common traps that you fall into, whether it's deferring to somebody else's leadership, not speaking up within a group, not feeling comfortable speaking up, or taking leadership, whether or not you should. And if you can identify some of these ahead of time, and then ask your team to help watch you for them, that can be useful. Questions on this? Yes.
Now I'm trying to decide if this is like, you know, like the technique that I used to use, whether it was relevant now, it's really be relevant. But when I mountaineering and outdoor stuff, and the same thing that I use with my personal people that I go with, we have a very much first we have a I used to teach about that everybody's opinion counts, like everybody's concern counts. Like it can't just let somebody's concern go away. And then we had a convincing thing. You have to give me 3 reasons why this is safe. So if I'm concerned about slope, my partner's like, let's just do it. I'm like, you have 3 chances to convince me. You have to be hard facts. It can't be just like blinders are on, right? And so that has worked for me on all my trips. The one time that I didn't follow through with it, one time we got in trouble. And I once had 2 mountaineering students who were on Denali. They were students of mine, I was on the way. And they were feeling concerned and they went to their guide and said, give me 3 reasons. He could not give it to them and they left the trip. They said, we're joining another group. And I was so proud of them because they took advantage. And I think in this scenario here, trail builders, we have to listen to some of our younger, inexperienced people, and if they are voicing a concern, we're be like, whoa, whatever, that's not a concern. You have to be able to willing to convince them that it's safe by giving them 3 hard facts. Like that. So that's kind of what we always do. I used to teach. That's how what we do, and I think it works. And kind of, it's like the Swiss cheese. You have to. The person has to give you the 3 barriers. Yeah. You know, the whole right. Like, well, I see a hole. You need to give me 3 chunks that are blocked. That's kind of.
I love that. That's a great example. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to move into the next section, but my point with this is that adopting some of these tools, and again, for me, it's that kill criteria concept and then the pre-mortem, those are the 2 that I'm most likely to actually use, can help me like bring those consequences to the forefront. If you're up for it within your organization, you might think about how you already do this. Got a good example there. What criteria do you already have? Which are, what can you add? We've got one more category, and it's the category that contains everything else. Decision-making tools rely on good communication. Communication is what makes everything work. My story about this was teaching at Eagle River, high water level. I've got my back to the river talking to my group. And there's this inebriated fisherman up in the rocks, just kind of chattering away. And I'm really trying to ignore him so I can like do the explanation I'm working on. And at some point I kind of let in what he's saying, and he's saying, hey, there's wood coming down the river. Which is super helpful for me to hear. Because we're about to go in the river, and it's just like, so man, communication, like figuring out how to make everybody feel comfortable speaking up when it is something like that. And that was really helpful. There's a lot of words here. Let me just tell you the point is that every one of these categories we've gone through in terms of communication
it's all communication. Incidents, one of the most common factors, I'm sure you can all relate to this. You hear about something went wrong within your organization, personal trip, whatever, it's like, man, we weren't on the same page. I thought you were gonna do this, like a miscommunication or a lack of communication. When we talk about risk, we work on a common vocabulary. That's so that we could communicate these concepts of risk. In terms of risk tolerance, leadership is tasked with communicating the organization's tolerance to the workers. Great. You as an individual, you can use your personal risk tolerance to say like, boy, this is just, I'm a little bit uncomfortable with this. This ice is thinner than I'm comfortable with. I'm out. Experience, we talk about how important it is to take the time to debrief and reflect, to fold that in, and to share it with peers through storytelling or other ways, share those learned experiences. Mistakes, how the organization responds matters, that communication response, whether or not you feel punished or rewarded as well as you can be for making a mistake. And then within these discussions prompting like, hey, what are the 3 ways that you can justify this? Awesome, right? That's all communication. I read this book and it wasn't very good, but it was about psychological safety. It's called The Fearless Organization. 2019, this isn't like, the stuff is still fairly fresh. And this is really this is again, another PhD that did a ton of research on organizations. Where is communication working? Where is it not working? And these are her take home points. Set the stage. So by this, she's talking about conveying to the organization, like what our priorities are, what's normal, what's not normal. And really a big part of this is trying to get people into that growth mindset rather than just sort of like checking the boxes and finishing the job. So setting the stage for the project. The point of building this crew to work on this trail is to provide this awesome recreation experience for hikers 2 years from now, but also for you to learn and you to have fun and blah, 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 get to know each other. I think a big part of setting the stage is role modeling the behavior that you want to see. So role modeling vulnerability and acknowledging when you don't know and acknowledging when you make mistakes so that the rest of your team thinks this is what's normal. It's normal for us to come in and say, man, I messed up. Within the military, for some reason, the Air Force has a really good reputation for being able to do this well. A pilot will come in and debrief with their team and say, I messed up. And it can be a trivial thing that nobody else saw or would have seen, but it's this sort of like the culture there is like, hey, I did this thing, I noticed my flaps, whatever, I don't know. And the team's like, oh yeah, cool, thanks for letting me know, I'll watch out for it. Role modeling vulnerability. Inviting participation, a few of you have already brought this up. Creating that environment where people want to or feel comfortable speaking up. Awesome. Easier said than done. And how do you do that? I mean, I don't think we'll have time to solve that, but you probably have some tricks for how to invite participation within your group. For me, again, that's really just like role modeling vulnerability and saying like, we're here to figure this out together. Let's work as a team. I can't do this all on my own. I don't want to be the only voice like I did this morning. Responding productively, this fits really well with that human and organizational performance concept. How we respond matters. So when somebody messes up, we pluck them out, punish them, or whether you find that way to support them. Say, thanks for bringing that up. This is a gap. This is a gap in our coverage. Acknowledge fallibility. This also fits into that. We're gonna make mistakes. It's unrealistic for us to plan for perfection. And then I love that she includes this, celebrate curiosity. So the more we go into this with that mindset of like, let's try to figure out how to make this better, awesome. That growth mindset is a huge key in what enables us to communicate and make everybody comfortable speaking up on this. Like, oh, did you see that bared in over there? Great. Thanks for pointing that out. Anything you would want to add to these? What's worked within your organizations?
I had a coach, you do this thing if someone didn't know the answer to a question, or like no one wanted to raise their hand, you know what this is, you like to pick on something, be like, thanks for participating. Essentially someone to provide the wrong example. So it could be corrected,
nice.
Instead of like assuming that and harming you with what's going on. Even though no great they're like to say, I don't know.
Nice.
a big part of this book was about choosing questions that are actually like, instead of a rhetorical question, I see this a lot with in the instructor circles that I'm in, where it's sort of like, would this be a good idea? And they're prompting them to say, no. It's like, you don't actually care about that question or answer. And the point then would be to come up with a better question, which is like, what are the 3 reasons why this isn't a good idea? So the questions we use, I think that's something I want to get better at after having read this book. So the takeaway within this communication block is that this is the key to our risk management. And this is what I'm still trying to figure out. Hopefully I can have a more concrete cheat sheet for you in a couple of years. It's like, man, how do we get good at this? And my strategy now is just to ask people like, where does this work? Like, what are you doing that's working to create these environments where people feel comfortable speaking up when it matters? So you might take some moments within your organization to think about where communication works and where it doesn't. Gaps you might fill. I have to give you this teaser because I just ordered these stickers. I had Sarah Glaser draw this up. This is a style I'm trying for the debrief. We all know it's like, oh, the debrief, do the debrief, like share your lessons learned, but it's actually pretty hard to do that at the end of the day. And so I came up with this idea to kind of gamify it with rock, paper, scissors. And I've done this with a big group, and everybody throws rock, paper, scissors. And then the rocks are responsible for bringing up, what did we do well? What did we rock? And then the paper comes up with notes for next time. What are the things we want to do differently next time? And then the scissors is, when were we cutting it close? Like, when were we running with scissors? So I'll have stickers of these someday, but I've already used this more than any other debrief model that I've tried before because it's kind of a pain in the butt. Part of that's because we don't often get instant rewards from debriefing. It's not like you debrief and you're like, sweet, I caught a mistake. But this has been fun and it's kid friendly. What did we rock? Notes for next time. When were we cutting it close? So I'll just close with a quick example of where I feel like this worked. I had a couple guides from Washington State come up. They're going to do a float trip in the Brooks Range. They haven't been in the Brooks Range. They haven't been on these boats. They got 2 kids, a teenager and a younger boy. And they're like super certified, qualified guides. And so they reached out and I just was partly impressed right there. They're already experts in the outdoor game. And they identified a gap in their knowledge and they said, can you help us fill that gap? And I said, sure, but I've never been in these boats. I've never paddled with a kid. So let's figure out how to do this. And so we worked through a progression. We started in a lake and we went to a slowly moving river. And then we went into the willow section here, a couple of class 2 rapids. And I was just like, what could go wrong if you fall out of your boat? So let's just practice that in all of these environments. Fall out, fall back in, fall, or get pulled back in. And I said, can the daughter pull the mom in? Can the toddler pull the dad in? We figured out what they could and couldn't do. And then they went to the Alapna and they did their float trip. And at the end of their float trip, and last day, the mother-daughter capsized and the daughter pulled the mom in. And it was just like, no big deal. It wasn't scary. And it was just so cool that they, even coming in with this high level of expertise, owning a guiding company and all this, they saw, yeah, it's worth us investing some time and some money to fill this gap. Because this thing could happen. Mistake, yeah, it could happen. What are we gonna do about it? We're gonna reduce our vulnerability with our TFDs, blah, 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 with training. And then how rewarding it was for this 13-year-old daughter to pull her mom in and be like, I'm badass, that's so cool. I really love that. And that example is really rewarding for me. So here's my take home for you, 3 points that might be applicable to your work. Good communication is risk management. We should expect the mistakes, anticipate the mistakes, and really focus on the consequences. And then I'm still working on this, trying to get better at like that feel of not normal, or of nearly normal. Sorry, it's like a lot of times that's kind of this subtle, visceral, subconscious, or like, man, something doesn't quite feel right. I want to get tuned into that so that it triggers check-in, change. Let's change our plan. Have that communication. Okay. Anything you want to add? Take on points? This is the last slide. Thank you.
I think one thing for our organizations, I learned this from Deb Iango, is like, it's really easy to think about risk in like, is someone gonna cut off their leg with a chainsaw? Like, hospitals and death are like really obvious risks, but like, if you own a business, like, there's not visible risk. There's like reputational risk, and there's financial risk, and there's like all these other risks. And my personal example is like, we have talked about what would it take to provide housing to our groups, and that sounds like just like a nice thing to do. But it's a bunch of people who don't necessarily know each other. It's like, it would cost money. It's a bunch of people who don't know each other, of different backgrounds, different genders, put together in a house between the ages of 20 and 35. And I'm like, that's an operational risk. Like, what could happen and who is responsible and what behavior is enforced? We're not enforced. And so I think like having language in the community to talk about risk, it's like obvious to apply it to like chainsaws, like those, that's a hazard, we're exposed to it, how do we reduce the risk involved? But like, if we just start using all that language with all our kinds of risks, it makes it really easy to talk about in other settings where like the risk is not dismemberment, it's something financial or something like legal. And it's kind of nice to use the same language for everything.
Yeah, I'm totally on board with that, and part of building this and working with soldiers on it, it's like that same idea, it's like these same concepts are still relevant to them, even though they're trying to solve very different problems than you, and I don't know if I'll ever take this to like a financial organization or a big business, but it's like what we can learn, what you've already learned through your time in the mountains is super relevant to the decisions that corporations are making, that politicians are making. It's like, we're playing the same game. I think, I mean, it's, this stuff is so relevant to marriage. It's like crazy. It's like, man, I can apply all this to all those factors in my life. And that's been pretty rewarding.
One thing I've thought about a lot, wrestled with both from the like group participant level and the manager writing the risk management policy level, is the tension between having all the rules written down in your manual is this thick, actually being a barrier at times to employees making the decision in the field. You know, I've been in situations where someone made a really bad and objectively bad decision, and they said, but that handbook said to do this, right? They were blinded to the situation because they were following the manual they were given. You know, I'm thinking about some of the things like planning is everything, but plan is nothing. From an organization perspective, it feels safer to write down all the rules that your employees then have to follow. And it also feels efficient, saying we're gonna have one person spend the winter season making that manual, and then every staff person still distribute it during onboarding and we'll be good to go. Whereas actually, in my experience, it's like, that doesn't work.
Yeah.
There's a lot of ways that you can work through that, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on that tension between, hey, I want to have everything prescribed because that prevents any problem, and that actually disempowering people to make the decisions sometimes.
I think based on the research I've done, the target is to have the leaders convey that risk tolerance so well that their empowered staff can make that decision without checking back up the line. And I think it was Gary Klein has written about this a bit, and he's got examples about like, I won't even bring it up because I'll butcher it, but he's like, I won't try to figure it out. There was like what are the boats with the missiles, the big, okay, maybe but like destroyer, like a destroyer is, and this, oh, I'm not even gonna try it. Basically, like the guys on the boats with the missiles were like, should we fire? And the leadership was like, only fire if it feels right. And they're like, well, what does that mean? And they didn't fire, and then that started World War II. That's the end of that story. The point being, like, how do you both empower the people so they don't need to check up the lines? What are the words you're using to say, like, you should make this call, but you should make this call within this tolerance that I've predefined and communicated really well. Because absolutely, we can make all these plans, but man, for anybody that's responded to like a rescue effort, like your training doesn't look at all like what actually happens. This is what the PJs do, right, with their $1 million budgets. They do a training and they just throw in random factors to each training to try to make it as random as possible. Because the reality is whatever they experience for real is going to have a bunch of random stuff happen. So it's like having the checklist of A through F doesn't necessarily work, but knowing I'm allowed to do these things, I'm not allowed to do these things, and now I have to make a call. I think that's what your target is. There's some other.
Understood, I want that, I think one of the things that I took from that, I mean, with that, not thinking. The goal is shifting away from, we wrote the rule book. And now we have it published, everyone has to know what the rules are, instead creating decision-making framework. So that people don't have to be like, the rule book said this, so I did it, I was empowered to make this right decision, make a good decision. In the moment based on a dynamic environment, as opposed to, oh, I wrote the rule where I followed that deals. Or way more black and white in the situations that we can find or something. So I think that's the difference. Like, I know like when I worked at the federal government, it was a lot more like these are the rules. And now we're moving forward. How can I make the decisions based on the information available? And I think that's what shifts that sense of how.
And I think those rules work in a really simple environment. As you bring yourselves into complex working environments, that's where I think you need to be more adaptive. Does that make sense? Like in a factory, it might work just well to say A, B, C, D, but out here, like, okay, there's a bear.
We threw a little bit on our incident response sheet, because if you get into situations where like maybe the handbook has a decision there, but maybe work it up real quick. We've got just a note at the very beginning of it. It says the sheet can't address every possible situation. You're expected to use your best judgment and common sense. When in doubt, use cautious common sense as your guide. So like it says like, okay, this is just a guide for you. Try to be smart, use your experience. Like that's probably good for you to maybe a better selection here. Don't just follow the checklist.
Yeah, I love that. And I've heard it said other ways where it's like, you have a packing list for the backcountry or whatever. It's like your brain is on the list. It's like, don't forget to, forget to think.
One of the things regarding communication. Those of us who work federal, state, county governments, or anything like that. One of our tasks is to communicate upholding. Quite often, you'll get the management to say, this is the way to do something. And not here, but we can get it all there. Okay.
What happens if they're on the line of early retirement? Like,
I pissed off when I was super bad.
I just emphasize the importance of communicating up and down. So that management knows, like, I know you think this is how we do things, but it's actually how we have to do things because of these other constraints, because we're in a complex environment, because there are bears. Okay, I think we're out of time.
Thank you.
Yes.
This contact information is up there, so